Hello, everyone. I hope you guys can see us now. Let's take a look. And I'm hoping that everybody can see us. Yes, I guess. So we are very excited today to have Tony with us. Tara says something is wrong. What is wrong? Brad says yes, but Tara says something is wrong. Tara, what is wrong? Could you elaborate? Yes.
Okay, most people.
Okay. So, Tara, maybe you have two tabs open and you're hearing echoes. That could be the reason. Okay, so hi, everyone. We're very excited to have Tony today. We're hoping that this is going to be a very lively discussion. We just wanted to, in the beginning, very briefly, for a few minutes, honor Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away last week, just go around and say a little bit about how we are going to try to ensure that in our communities, whatever your community is, we all make an effort to honor the sorts of rights and the sorts of equality that she was working for her own life and she fought until the last day for. And if you can vote, please do. If you can encourage others to vote, please do. If you are in a department or you're in any kind of meeting, please ensure that you make sure everybody's voices get heard, make sure that there is some sense of equality and that you can contribute to it however you can. Here at the Learning Salon, we really encourage junior members and underrepresented minorities of any sorts in science to speak up, to talk to us. If you see us doing anything wrong, please either talk to us or to Brad and Kanaka, who are kindly managing the chats. And I hope that you guys take a minute this week to think about how you want to contribute to the kind of legacy that RBG left behind. A gentle reminder, be respectful to each other in the chat. During the talk, ask for clarification questions in the chat. And please add the ask a question, click the ask a question sort of menu below and add your questions and also vote on each other's questions. I think maybe John or Jovo wanted to say something as well. I'm gonna give them a second to reflect.
Thank you, Ida. And Tony, we were just speaking before we went online about how this kind of venue can be a new way of doing science, doing it more inclusively, have conversation at no matter what stage of your career you're at, and have people from all over the world feel that they can jump into the room and ask any question they want. And in that spirit, I think it's great that Ida is leading the initiative for us to not pretend we're in a bubble and that we can talk about the world we're in before we start the science. Two little things. One is about RBG. My mother's 81 and she lives around the corner. And it was extremely interesting to me and saddening to me to see what a devastating effect her death has had on women of her generation. And she came from the era of Mad Men, when the stories of how men treated her are just truly shocking. And RBG has been an idol of my mother's for a long time. And I think the way that as soon as she died, that bunch of men just ruthlessly took it as an opportunity to try and seize more power. The disrespect to an incredible woman is just very painful, I think, to other women and men who revered her. So I agree with you, Ida, completely, that it's shameful and we don't want to represent that and be a counterforce against that. I think we should also try and remember, Breonna Taylor and the unsurprising decision yet again that was handed down. And I'd like to again hope that we can be a counterforce and an inclusive space where we can voice our disgust at that kind of thing. So those are my two thoughts, my mum and about Breonna Taylor. And that's all I'll say about that right now.
I'll just reiterate what John and Ida both said so beautifully. I think we like to pretend science is objective, but we're all humans. Subjective means there's a subject involved, so it always is, and all of our work is not truly in a real bubble, but really it's in the context of the world going on, and so it is upon all of us to appreciate that and take responsibility for that. And we, here at the Learning Salon, I think we're making every effort. And if there's anything else we can do to make sure our community is more inclusive, please let us know. It is as high a priority as all the other parts of this. They go part and parcel. It's not like you can really separate intellectualism and diversity. The whole point is having a diverse discussion with people with different ideas and different backgrounds. And the more different people with different backgrounds can openly share their perspectives, the more we all learn together and the better we can make the world together for everybody. Okay, with that, should I introduce Tony? Great. So thanks everybody for coming to this. Tony, I've been a big fan of Tony's work for a really long time. I'll just share one anecdote. I'm not even sure Tony remembers this, but many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I crashed Cold Spring Harbor for a course on basically imaging. And I applied and I didn't get in, and I just showed up, and it was great. They for the first week or so, I just slept out on the beach, and eventually they were kind enough to take me in, and I learned a tremendous amount there. But one of the things I learned is the kindness of the people in that community. And in particular, Tony took me into his office as really I was a vagrant, interrupting the course more or less. And we had great discussions about science. He's incredibly open-minded and talked about lots of different ways, different things. At the time, I think there was this big battle between Tony and people in my department about sparse versus rate coding and auditory cortex. And I just learned so much by watching the intellectual debate of what was the reason to believe one thing, what was the reason to believe the other thing, how could they both be true, how could they both be not true. And then as his work continues to get to evolve, his work, obviously this article we're about to talk about, and then the BARSeq stuff and all the connectome sequencing stuff is really, I think, beautiful and ties to what we were talking about the last few times, which is what's the hard part of science, and it's asking the right questions. And there was really no model and there was no experiment. It was just Tony saying, here's a question we don't know the answer to. Could we sequence the connectome and do it cheaper and better? And the answer, is not clear yet, but it's a really interesting question. And I think that's the kind of thing that drives intellectual and interesting science. And so I'm really excited to discuss with him, well, whatever he wants to talk about, but in particular, his critique of pure learning. Thanks, Tony.
Am I talking now?
Yep.
Well, thanks for that great introduction. I do remember that very well. I will say I thought you were literally homeless, and I wasn't really clear that you were actually affiliated with any academic institution. So it's a pleasant surprise to see that you did manage to get an affiliation. Congratulations. I know those were great times. So I thought I would just say a few words and maybe show a few slides to sort of lay out some of the things I've been thinking about recently, and then open it up for more discussion. But one of the sort of technological hurdles that I have not been able to overcome is how to share my screen on Crowdcast. And so for that reason, I have sent my slides actually to all three hosts. So any one of you has the potential to share a couple of slides. Look at that. Look at that.
And perhaps delete some of them.
Yeah, well, that's right. You can go ahead, and that does put you at an unfair advantage in this discussion. But, yeah, especially the hide slide function doesn't seem to be working well in this mode, but I guess we'll just live with that. Anyway, all right. So this is my generic opening slide. A lot of my lab these days is focused on taking brains, grinding them up, and and trying to figure out how you go from a connectome to computation. And I tried to strip down what I wanted to say into 4 basic ideas. So those are the summary, which maybe we could go to the summary slide here. Okay. Could we do that? I mean, no.
I tried, it didn't work. I'm going to try again.
Oh, that's so sad. All right, well, let me just give you the summary of what I wanted to say. Oh, look at that. That's awesome. The summary is that we have the parts list of the brain, but we're missing the wiring diagram. The basic wiring diagram for animals is mostly innate, and I believe that learning is almost an afterthought for most animals. It's a big step to artificial mouse intelligence, but only a small step, I would say, from mouse to intelligence, to language and cognition. And that the way to get there is by reverse engineering brains, and our ability to reverse engineer brains is driven by new technology. And I would say that a lot of the things that I've said there are received differently by different communities. So I think many neuroscientists would say that the things that I'm saying are so trivial as to not be worth saying. And I would say that a lot of AI people would say that what I'm saying is so wrong as to not be worth saying. But there's a consensus, I think, among many people that what I'm saying is not worth saying. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to argue that these things are worth saying. So next slide. I know that this seems to be the most challenging part here, but I was inspired by the idea of reverse engineering the brain. And in particular, there's this great quote from Richard Feynman, who says, what I cannot create, I do not understand. And I'll just point out that that quote was in the upper left-hand corner of his board, apparently, when he died. And so this is supposedly, this is an internet truth, so I don't know if it's really true, but this is what was on his board when he died, along with know how to solve every problem that has been solved. And so this is not only that quote, what I cannot create, I do not understand, has sort of stuck with me, but the idea that at any moment I could die and that I'll be remembered for what's on my board has also stuck with me. And so I've been very careful about what I leave on my board, and in particular to erase some of the things that my 10-year-old has written there. So next slide. So, you know, here's the actual inspiration I had for reverse engineering the brain. I grew up on all sorts of science fiction. And if this were a live audience, I would pose this as a test to see, I think really the challenging one here for people who are not American of a certain generation is the bottom left. So if anyone wants to put that one into the chat, go for it. But if we go on to the—
You can't see the bottom left.
You can't.
It's occluded by the videos.
Oh, well, you know what? It's not worth worrying about it. Yeah, somebody could see it well enough to Jeff Kutchmar got it. So, and I'm going to bet that he is an American, not that much younger than me. So if we go on, so how would we revert? So if we had like working artificial intelligence like shown there, how would we reverse engineer it? We take it apart, right? We would not just sit there chit-chatting to the robot. We wouldn't sit there observing its behavior. What we would do is take off its face and start poking around in the wires there. And that thought that that's the way to proceed is really what led me into neuroscience. So if we go to the next slide, basically we do have an existence proof of how intelligence works on this planet. And the people who study it, I would say, are neuroscientists. And what we do is let's see, we should be on the next slide here. What we do is yeah, there we go. Just go through the animation. We take it apart. And over the last 50 or 100 years, we actually have gotten a really good sense of what the parts list is for nervous systems. We know an awful lot about the molecules. We know an awful lot about how synapses work. I was trained as a synaptic and cellular neurophysiologist. There's still plenty to learn, but if you ask me, what we're missing is not a little bit of extra information about how synapses or neurons work, but really what's on the next slide, which is how to piece these together. So, you know, with all these parts lists, we still don't necessarily know how to make a functioning organism. So, you know, this slide says, I just bought a book from IKEA, and of course, simply having a bunch of tiles with letters on them would be enough to construct any book, perhaps, but is not in itself a book. You need to know how those pieces go together. So, and if you put them together incorrectly, sticking with the sci-fi theme here, I was always inspired by this particular episode from the first Star Trek, where some aliens assemble a little girl who crashes, a little human girl who crashes on their planet, and in fact they misassemble her, and she kind of looks like the one on the person on the right. Then they also have an illusion, so she looks like the one on the left. But basically, if you assemble the pieces wrong, you don't get the right outcome. So tremendous. Next slide. As we all know, there have been tremendous advances in neuroscience. Next slide. I'm sorry, in AI, but these are lots of examples for which for a different audience I go through, but go to the next slide. Really, there are two big challenges, I would say. We need machines that, machines that interact with the world. And that's something that pretty much all animals do pretty well. You might call it lower animal intelligence. And we also would like machines that achieve some level of cognition. So, you know, a machine that could hold a good conversation with us. And not sure if you can really see it, but I tried to glue a robot head onto the third member of that conversation. So these are the two challenges. And if you go to the next slide, I would argue that really they're the same challenge, or almost the same challenge. So one is dramatically harder than the other. And I read here a quote from Hans Moravec, AI pioneer, who wrote, "Encoded in the large, highly evolved sensory and motor portions of the human brain is a billion years of experience about the nature of the world and how to survive in it. The deliberate process we call reasoning is, I think, the thinnest veneer of human thought, effective only because it is supported by this much older and much more powerful, though usually unconscious, sensory motor knowledge. We are all prodigious Olympians in perceptual and motor areas, so good that we make the difficult look easy. Abstract thought, though, is a new trick, perhaps less than 100,000 years old. We have not yet mastered it. It is not all that intrinsically difficult. It just seems so when we do it." And so really what this argues in the next slide is that really there's only what animals do is hard, cognition and reasoning is the easy part, and the problem on the left is the hard part, and the problem on the right is the easy part, but only if it's easy only if you've solved the problem on the left. So now with that quick preamble, I'm going to quickly go through why, how I think things could be done differently, or what my sort of take on the relationship is between how we're approaching an AI and how biological organisms become intelligent. So as we all know, most modern AI relies on learning. Supervised learning is probably the most successful set of algorithms right now. But it can take, so this is an example, you take, lots and lots of labeled pictures and you use backpropagation, and you convert the knowledge of how to classify those pictures into synaptic weights. But it can take lots and lots of examples to learn all those parameters. And in the next slide, it is there to remind me that humans do not rely mostly on supervised learning. Labeling objects every second for a year would be 3 times 10 to the 7 training examples. And that's clearly not what happens, in spite of the fact that those of us with children do go through a stage where we think our children are asking us why 3 times 10 to the 7 times. So how about unsupervised learning? So there's this thought in in the AI field that unsupervised learning is where it's at. Jan LeCun said in 2016 that if intelligence is the cake, the bulk of the cake is unsupervised learning, the icing is supervised, and the cherry on top is reinforcement learning. But I would argue that even unsupervised learning in the next slide is not enough, and the evidence for that is all the amazing things that animals can do pretty much from the time they're born. They're not doing this by unsupervised learning. Squirrels figure out how to jump from tree to tree very quickly, but even more quickly a colt can stand, and a spider can hunt. And there are some, next slide, innate behaviors that don't involve learning at all. Termites don't learn how to make termite mounds. Birds, there is a learning component, but there's a nest that's characteristic of particular bird species. And again, there's a learning component to beaver dams, but it's largely an innate behavior. And just, you know, there's a great example in the next slide of work from Hopi Hoekstra at Harvard, who's been studying sort of the detailed, the genetics by which, or the relationship between the genetics and particular innate behaviors. And she studies two kinds of closely related mice, one of which makes a tunnel like you see on the left, which is long, and the other of which makes a tunnel like you see on the right, which is short. And it turns out that if you take the one type of mouse and you let it be raised by foster parents on the other side, by the other type of mouse, it will make the other kind of tunnel. So the type of tunnel that a mouse makes is determined not by its parents, but by its genes. So in the next slide, I do promise I'm coming down the home stretch here. Animals aren't even all that good at learning. Next slide, the brain comes pre-packaged. So it's not like that, but it's more like this on the next slide. So summary so far, AI intelligence relies on learning, natural intelligence relies on innate strategies. Where do innate behaviors come from? Next slide. They're encoded in the genome. Next slide. Basically, modern ANN can have 10 to the 8 synaptic parameters. Actually, I guess this is a little outdated before GPT-3, which has even more parameters. So they can have huge numbers of parameters. And these synaptic connections, with a couple other parameters, next slide, fully specify the function of an artificial neural network. So in a biological network, well, in an artificial neural network, next slide, where do these parameters come from? They come from learning, but how about in C. elegans or in a biological organism? Well, in biological organisms, these synaptic parameters are specified in the genome to some extent. So in C. elegans, they're almost completely specified in the genome. So I guess it was, Josh, you're the one who told me that the connectome of a C. elegans is not 100% stereotyped, but it's still very stereotyped, 80% stereotyped. And so, you know, that, but a C. elegans, which has 302 neurons, 7,000 synapses, you could comfortably fit even the perfect and 100% stereotyped connectome in a genome. It fits comfortably because of the size of the genome. But in the next slide, you can do a similar argument for humans and find that it takes way too many parameters to specify a brain explicitly for those parameters to fit in the genome. So there's about 6 or I'm not going to go through the calculation here, but there's about 6 orders of magnitude difference between the number of parameters it takes to specify the precise wiring of a human brain and the number of bits available in the human genome. And so what does that tell us? It tells us that there are rules for wiring up brains that are simpler than just explicit connectivity matrices. In fact, they're probably, we should be on the next slide, genome specifies. Yeah, so they should probably be, can you go to the next slide? yeah, whatever. So basically, there are rules for specifying brains. Some of these for wiring diagrams. Some of these rules are stochastic, and I'm just going to close because it seems like the thing has stopped. But I'll just close by citing one of my favorite quotes from Sidney Brenner, who writes, "Progress in science," or who once said, "Progress in science depends on new techniques, new discoveries, and new ideas, probably in that order." And if you go to the last two slides, I'll just say that this is sort of to riff on that. My notion of how progress in science works is that at any given moment, Josh, do you think you can get to the next slide, or just no can do? Yeah, all right. Well, basically, if you can't see the slide, then I'll just leave it at that, or maybe at my summary, which is we have the parts list, but we're missing the wiring diagram. The basic wiring diagram for animals is mostly innate. Learning is almost an afterthought for most animals. It's a big step to artificial mouse intelligence, but only a small step from mouse intelligence to language and cognition, which are the things that many people think are the hard part. And reverse engineering brains, our ability to reverse engineer brains in order to, i.e. to understand brains, is driven by new technologies first and foremost. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have lost John, so I think that probably Jova is going to try to re-invite him back. It might be another technical issue.
I think he was just so disgusted with what I said that he just, in spite of this whole thing about, yeah, we can have reasonable debates, I just got him so angry. He just walked
there's
away.
John. There's John. He didn't walk away. He's back.
I just had to go to the bathroom to throw up. I'm better now.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Well, I can say these are really beautiful slides that only I got to see, but they were very nice.
So, so I guess the way that usually, Tony, we do that, first of all, thank you so much for the clear slides, is that the three of us go around and we sort of give a small commentary and potentially give you the time to respond to it. And then we open it to the audience, and their questions are currently in the Ask a Question sort of area, but we usually encourage you to not look at them until the time arrives, so that they get to add questions and likes to each other's questions, so they can be voted up. So I'm going to go first this time. We really are potentially on very different parts of an approach to intelligence, and I'm always grateful that there is the opportunity to reflect where I am, thanks to you, and thanks to other people that I can strongly disagree with. So I'm going to start by trying to frame this commentary, and after you respond, and it would be great if Jova, you could mute your, because I can hear the noise. So, thank you. And so I'm going to try to put it together, and then maybe in the dialogue, more things can come out. If I may be so bold to say this, my impression every time I see these slides is that to stay in, so my favorite genre is speculative fiction, indeed, whether it comes to books or movies, but I think I also I have other repertoire also, hopefully, that I hope that the world sees and reads more of it too. In terms of speculative fiction, what I have to say about the slides is that we've seen this movie before. And I was born in the 80s, and I feel like a lot has changed from the 80s. And I think that your slides would have been pretty much the same in the 80s, including the movie references, if I may say that. And the reason I'm going to start there is that there are certain themes that I think have moved on from then, and the kind of the power that certain fields had back then, for good reasons, I think. And it's all been within my lifetime. So that's why I'm hoping to reflect maybe that sort of those perspectives. the first perspective is something that, in fact, was very in the philosophical debates of the 80s, and that was functionalism. And in this view, in order to understand a particular function, you don't necessarily need to go to the chemical and physical details of imitating it if you want to build a model, or if you want to look at the comparison of a particular function across different organisms. And when you say something like, there is a sort of, it seems like your idea of reverse engineering the brain is not functionalist at all. Basically, what you're interested in is neurons and their connection to each other. And it seems like you might not care as much about the particular function or the algorithms that are possible on the same sort of circuitry, which is a huge difference, by the way, between animals, whose majority of behaviors might benefit less from learning than humans, because the same hardware in humans can realize a lot of different kinds of algorithms that are not innate per se, and you cannot predict it on the basis of just their genes, what they're going to do in terms of especially a lot of collective human behavior, and what we have discussed before here in terms of sort of cognitive tools that humans build in order to do certain other things. We are capable of having many different algorithms in the same sort of architecture. And you mentioned that for some reason you think unsupervised learning is not enough. And I think that when it comes to those many different algorithms that animals show flexibility on, it actually matters a great deal. And then it comes to the issue of innateness versus flexibility. There is a level of flexibility that more innate creatures can afford, and there is a level of flexibility they just can't go beyond. And it brings us to the issue of learning and the whole idea of evolution per se, because you could think about learning as within organisms in a species. But if you're doing reinforcement learning, you don't just care about that, basically. You could think about meta-learning at multi-agent level across evolutionary scales. And in that sense, this sort of trade-off between innateness and flexibility, depending on the environment, depending on the requirements of the environment, over time is indeed a kind of a learning at a different scale that can happen. And so at the same time, you kept saying, oh, this by this creature is innate, this by that creature is innate. But again, depending on a particular problem at hand or a function at hand and how much flexibility it requires, the question is, what kind of innateness is worth wanting at the end of the day? How much functionalism is worth wanting as opposed to innateness? So I want to bring all of these things that I said back to your idea that the wiring diagram is missing, the first of your 4 points, which, okay, that's correct. And I think that there is some part of the scientific community that should always try to find that wiring diagram. But is it the holy grail, as you're saying? Is it going to be the fact that it is the biggest step in learning, because once we have a mouse intelligence, it's a small step to language, and all of human algorithms that have so much flexibility on the same human hardware? I don't think so. I think a lot of people will disagree with you, and not just AI people. A lot of, I think, cognitive scientists, psychologists, and neuroscientists would disagree with this view. Dare I say, especially those born after the 80s. And 4, I'm going to come back to this idea of reverse engineering the brain and the leap of faith that you're making with regards to the components mattering so much. And when it comes to functionalism, when it comes to the flexibility, innateness kind of dilemma that is going to push the gradients in learning, if we want to use that word, we can use other words, obviously, or the meta-learning at evolutionary scales of the architectures that can afford more flexibility at the same time as changes in the sort of the body and other things. We can also see that there are simply very interestingly similar functions that are evolving in different branches of animals. It doesn't go all back to the same origin. And an example of functionalism that I sometimes like to mention is the idea of pain and C fiber. And the fact that, for instance, this is an example since the 80s that people in functionalism provide, which is that pain in us might be identical to C fibers, but identifying pain as something that necessarily relies on C fiber is not accurate, because octopus could have behavior that is akin to pain without having C fibers. And so given all of these things, I have the privilege and the opportunity to disagree with you very respectfully, and look forward to hear what you have to say.
Yes.
That was really lovely, Ida.
I guess so. I guess my buffer overflowed a little while ago. So I'm not going to be able to. So I did get that you disagreed with a lot of what I said.
Do you want to recap?
And I did get that you made fun of me for being old and having sci-fi references that I have failed to update. I got those things. I guess maybe I'll just sort of say a few things. One is that it goes against my nature to want to study all these little details of how biology works. Like I started off wanting to be a physicist because I liked simple answers to simple questions. And I'm sure that had I been born even before I was born, at a time when symbolic AI was sort of on the rise, I certainly would have gone with symbolic AI as an obvious shortcut. Why would we even bother to worry our heads about all these little details that that are involved with brains? So like my impulse is to not want to get down and dirty with these details. But the reason that I think it's important is that although I'm incredibly impressed with the amount of progress at the sort of engineering level that has been made in the last few decades in what is actually, it's funny, it's now called AI, but when I was a kid, AI meant symbolic AI, and we used the term neural networks. And now I guess symbolic AI has died to the point where no one's even worried about being confused with someone who adheres to the ideas of symbolic AI. So, what my hope, by the way, is not that, so I do, my day job these days is indeed to try to figure out what the connectivity, what the wiring diagram is. But I certainly don't believe that we're going to build a computer or an artificial system that uses exactly that wiring diagram. Rather, the idea is that what we would like to do is abstract the principles that make the wiring diagrams that are in real brains different from the ones that are currently used in artificial systems. And in some sense, it's not necessarily, I'm going to leave it at that for now, just so I don't. I mean, if you can maybe peel off one or two comments for me to push back on.
Sure. So first of all, I want to highlight that I wasn't referring to you being old, but the idea of innateness being older than even the 80s, and then the time where innateness was a powerful argument was probably the 70s. And then, as the decline of the Chomsky sort of traditions.
I was not, I was not trained as a cognitive psychologist. I was not even trained as a real psychologist. So I have gone back and tried to review some of those arguments about innateness. And I got to say, I probably should find a different word, because that word is loaded and it carries a lot of baggage.
That's right. That's right.
And I find it's every generation there are some words that get like nature and nurture, right? Like no biologist these days argues about nature or nurture, right? It's obvious that every single case is both, and the real question is, how do nature and nurture interact to generate what we have? So in the same sense, there's no such thing practically as pure innateness or pure learning. There is an interaction between them, and what I want to emphasize is that just that whatever the reason we're humans and not C. elegans is really because of our genomes. no matter how hard you try to train a C. elegans, it will not be a human. And that's because its cells are made of DNA that is C. elegans DNA and not human DNA. So whatever, at some level, we all have to accept that there are significant differences between species that is due to DNA. Now, again, a lot of these weird debates about innate versus learned and nature versus nurture have to do with communities that spend all their time focusing on humans. And it's a complex and sort of charged and very difficult to get a handle on set of issues in trying to tease apart the contribution of genes and environment in humans. So that, again, I really don't find that a terribly interesting discussion, and it's not the one that sort of drives what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the difference between a dog and a pig and a bird and a worm.
So here is, I think, where you might fall in the same trap that the innateness people of the 70s fall into and the symbolic AI. They also didn't like learning. And I think that you have these two things in common, in fact, with that tradition. But here's the thing that we are also saying, I think that what John and I have been discussing sometimes is that
can I just push back on, I mean, again.
I kind of want to finish this point if that's okay.
But to say that I don't like learning, I mean, I spent, half my career training animals to perform tasks and figuring out how they learn to perform them. And I guess
one of your slides actually explicitly said that learning is almost an afterthought for animals, and a lot of your slides were, so let's keep it at that level. I'm talking within the reference of your slides, which you explicitly had big letters written there. So let's keep it within that. And within that, yes, there are different species and different algorithms have different architectures. We are no longer, again, although this was in the history of neuroscience much more common in the past, we are not training random neural networks. And I mean, some people are. Majority of us, either in AI or in neuroscience, are not training random neural networks. There is architecture to it, to the sort of different kind of neural networks that we are building. And there is a flexibility associated with these different architectures. Some of them cannot do multitasking, some of them can. Some of them cannot do any kind of transfer, some of them can. Likewise, there are animals that can, and there are animals that can't do multitasking or or show flexible transfer across different environments, which was one of my points, to sort of break down my points maybe one by one if I said too many things at the same time. One thing, yes, different species could correspond. It's very similar to different architectures in algorithms. And you could imagine a sort of a meta learning of different architectures, which is very similar to the progress of evolution. And functionally, different kinds of architectures could come up with similar functions. But the most important thing is that the ones that are capable of more learning are the ones that can show more flexible behavior. And humans are the ones that actually show most of that. And
absolutely.
And the thing that sort of John and I keep saying about the sort of your third point that you were mentioning, your third point was explicitly, it's a big step to artificial mouse intelligence, but it's a small step from mice to language and cognition. This is the point I profoundly disagree with. And I think that humans are not just better trained rats. There is no amount of training you can give a rat to act like a human or have nowhere near as many algorithms that humans can have. Therefore, I think the step from mouse to human is so large and it's so much that step within the realm of functionalism that we don't need to know more about these kinds of.
Can I tell you what I mean by that?
Of course, love to hear.
So I'm going to when I say steps here, I have a notion of how we can even quantify how big a step is, right? We could quantify it in terms of iterations over evolution, and a sort of surrogate of that is, so something like generations times population per generation. That's like a unit of steps in evolution, right? Because and we could actually infer something about that by looking at genomes, right? So basically, as creatures evolve, they change their genome. So we can literally measure how far it is from creatures that have language, that are capable of language, and creatures that don't. So we kind of know that so I'm of the camp that accepts that sort of accepts the experiments that basically say that gorillas and chimps don't have language in the sense that we do. Okay, so I'm impressed by what Coco the gorilla can do, but in some sense, I think that was evidence that gorillas can't really speak. We diverged from the great apes, from gorillas, I think about 6 million years ago. Depending on exactly whether you think Neanderthal was capable of language or not, we developed language maybe of order a couple 100,000 years ago, maybe 1 million years ago. Our ancestors developed language, all right? So that kind of tells us how far in steps of evolution, in steps of the DNA that enables one species to have language and not another. That tells us how far we have to go. It's not very far. It actually, like,
from gorilla or from mouse?
Yeah, actually, it turns out the difference, well, from gorilla to human fits on one old school floppy, the kind that was around in the 80s, old school floppy disk. From gorilla to human. From mouse to human, it's about, if you can do the calculation, it fits on about 1 or 2. It's about 1 or 2 megabytes. So the amount.
I'm not sure how. Okay, I'm not sure how this is useful. Sorry. Let me stop you there, because it sounds like a rhetoric point.
Units, so in order to specify a brain, right?
Yeah.
It takes of order. We can bound it. It's less than a gigabyte. It's probably less than 100 megabytes. And the difference between a brain that's capable of speech and one that isn't is like a
I'm sorry. I'm profoundly. I feel like this is a diversion, and it has nothing to do with the discussion of functionalism, because the same floppy disk could have an operating system, or it could have a game, or it could have data about somebody's health. It could have so many things. There is nothing about the fact that how much space you have on a particular thing that is telling you about all the different algorithms that it could have. So I'm going to, if please allow me to put this aside. Let's focus, instead of strange analogies, let's focus on
because I think it reflects how differently we view the problem. From my point of view, the problem is how many bits does it take to specify the rules that it takes to generate the neural network that is capable of learning language, right? So one genome, ours, specifies a brain that is capable of acquiring language. It takes a lot of bits after that. It takes a lot of experience. You have to spend a couple of years learning a language, but my brain is capable of learning a language. Another brain, that brain of a gorilla, is not.
So it sounds like you are profoundly not interested in the issue of learning at all, because you're only interested in what is the difference between a genome of a human versus a mouse?
No, I think that the learning part is actually very simple if you have the right substrate. So I'm interested in it, but I think that when I said that I'm not impressed by learning in rats, so my lab started off training rats to do things that previously the other labs used non-human primates. And initially I was told by all the people who worked on non-human primates, we would never be able to train rats in the same way that we could train non-human primates. And over the years, it turned out that, it was actually not so hard, because what we had to do was we had to adapt the tasks to do the things that rats wanted to do anyway. In other words, the learning component of those tasks that we train rats and frankly non-human primates in labs on are trivial. Whereas what's the hard part is the part that we don't study for the most part, the innate part. Those are the hard parts, right? To train an art, like sometimes I have students coming into my lab saying, hey, why don't I train an artificial system to do the task that the rat does in the lab? Well, the task that we ask the rat to do in the lab is hear a sound and go left, hear a sound and go right. Same with the monkey, right? I mean, it's a little more complicated, but none of those are challenging at all from a learning point of view. The hard part would be to build a robot that actually did those things.
So I'm going to bring it back again to what I was saying before the diversion, which was, you were saying that it's a big step to an artificial mouse intelligence, and from there a small step to human language and cognition. And I'm disagreeing with that. And no amount of floppy disks are going to change the fact that you're missing a lot of things if you're focusing only on genetics. But I'm going to now stop talking, because I want to hear also from John and Jovo. Thank you so much for engaging in this. And we're trying to make this salon-like and fun. So thank you for being such a great sport with this.
So that was really fun for me to hear you guys talk. It's interesting. You have such different perspectives. You know, someone on Twitter asked earlier this week, like, how do we maintain a positive world view given everything that's going on? And I think one thing that really helps me is talking to you people, the people on the chat, the people here, and just having intellectual discussions about what we should be doing. So I really appreciate Ida's questions and Tony trying to answer them. So my question is really totally as diametrically different from Ida's as possible, I think. Mine is, you make a bunch of claims. Your argument is mostly philosophical in nature. And so what I would like you to tell us is, in a sense, one could imagine an experiment that says, what experiment do you think you could propose that one could conceivably run that would provide evidence in favor of your hypothesis?
So you're asking, what is my research program? Because, you know, my day job is to be an experimentalist. So but if I could think of a killer experiment, I would have done it already. Instead, what I'm doing is, my idea is that if we, it's more of a vision than a hypothesis. My idea is that if we could look at a bunch of connectomes and we really squinted hard at them, we would say, aha, there are some organizing principles there that allow us to go from these connectomes to interesting behaviors, and we would see that insight. Now, is it going to be that easy? You know, there are a few cases where you can read off function readily from structure. So Watson and Crick is like the home run in that, right? They figured out the three-dimensional structure of DNA, and from that they said, aha, we figured out how heredity works to first order. Okay, how DNA replication works. Amazing, right? This molecule suggested a way of it copying itself. Okay, I'll just say that's the exception. Like, that would be fantastic if we got a whole bunch of connectomes, we looked at them and said, aha, now we figured out intelligence. But I'm not putting my eggs in that basket.
Right. No, I totally agree with you. And, you know, I think my day job is just thinking about stuff. But, you know, in practice, most of what I've been thinking about since grad school is how to study the connectome, because I think if we had it, it would be really useful for understanding cognition. I think, you know, my perspective is that it's obviously not sufficient, but it's not obviously necessary, but it might help a lot. And I think it's likely to help a lot insofar as constraining our models into realistic implementation level mechanisms. But and your day job, as far as I can tell, is based on the assumption that we're right? That if we got the connectome, it would be really useful.
Yeah, I mean, actually, what I really want is the connectome along with the neural activity in the context of an interesting behavior. But yeah.
So the question is, can't we figure out an experiment that really suggests evidence in favor of the thing you're claiming? So you've claimed a bunch of stuff, but one of them is that, say, learning is easy once you have the other stuff. But is there an experiment you can think of where we quantify the extent to which it's easy, say for something that humans have never tried to do before, in a domain where we don't have 20 years of experience? Like, I'm just making stuff up. Like, give someone a sensor on their tummy that tells them vibrations, and the vibrational pattern corresponds to direction. Like, I know people can learn to have directions when you do that. How quickly can we learn that?
No, just to be clear, when I say that learning is easy, what I mean is the cases where animals learn, the learning part was easy. Right? Animals aren't very, like, I would go as far as to say that perhaps artificial systems already are much better at learning than animals. And to the extent that animals outperform artificial systems in many settings, it's because they come to the table with much better innate knowledge.
And I'm agreeing with you, and I'm saying, wouldn't it be interesting if we could think about an experiment that really quantified the extent to which machines can learn more efficiently than animals, where we put them kind of on a like apples to apples comparison, where we don't use the animal's whole life as background.
I bet your neural network could learn very quickly to pick out 5 patterns of white noise far more quickly than any human, right? You present random static, random white noise, right? Visual white noise, and you train up the system so that there are 5 specialized patterns that are rewarded and the rest are not rewarded. You know, it's easy to, in fact, the default neural network where you represent 1 pixel with 1 neuron will catch that without a problem, whereas humans, especially if you make it 20, just to make it a little bit trickier. So, because you might be able to memorize 1, but I think we'd have a hard time memorizing 20. So I think that's a perfect example where, you know, that is such an unnatural system, and yet, you know, the power of artificial learning systems is such that it would pick that up immediately, whereas that does not at all conform to the sort of priors that we go into the visual world with. Right.
Yeah,
so that's
I 100% agree with you. I think it's exactly right. I think this whole idea when people talk about artificial general intelligence is more or less hoo-ha in the sense of
I totally agree.
It's specialized intelligence. It's human intelligence.
We define artificial general intelligence as something. Actually, the way we really define it is whatever intelligence is left after the best current systems are observed. So. But really, it's defined with respect to our own abilities, right? That's the less cynical view, is that we're asking a system to match our abilities.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think that was really interesting for me to hear you actually have a concrete experiment, so thanks. John?
Melanie writes in the comments, he's saying that neural networks have less bias about what is worth learning than humans. That's part of what I'm saying. I think the other thing that sort of got lost is, I think that it's not just specific bias about what's out there. What I didn't say is I believe, you know, my religious sort of attachment is to the idea that there is something like a canonical cortical circuit, some magic architecture that is that enables you know, the scaling of the cortex and allows it to be super powerful. So when I say that I want a connectome, the reason I really want it is that I believe that by looking at it, we might be able to figure out what that canonical cortical circuit is. Anyway.
I think at some point we should get Melanie to if she could come on later, because she had a couple of other comments. Usually at some point. Oh, what happened? John just.
So what happened was that I looked at John, and it turns out he's on the bottom right of my screen, and that was next to the scrolling questions.
Right.
So it's all Melanie's question.
John needs to get reconnected right now.
I think he went to throw up again.
So okay, so okay, waiting for him to reconnect. Jovo, can you invite Melanie on screen while John is trying to get reconnected so we can use the time? So Melanie, we're going to invite you right now just to make sure.
Incidentally, Melanie also has some very interesting questions.
Yeah, she had also earlier in the chat. I wasn't looking at the chat, but I was just told by Kanaka and Brad that she's been asking great questions. Hi, John.
Hi, Melanie. Welcome back.
Hi. Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Tony.
Hey.
I have a question. First, I was on this last week, and I also couldn't share my slides, so I had to send them.
That is the true challenge of AI. But
yeah.
Apparently, only artificial intelligence will ever be able to share slides, because natural intelligence can't.
That's absolutely right. So my question was, you keep talking about reverse engineering the brain and saying that that's how we're going to get to intelligence. But that kind of implies that intelligence is all in the brain. So I want to get your thoughts on how much is the body involved? How much is the innate structure of our body required to for intelligence.
That's a great point, and maybe I should revise how I say it. I mean, I don't actually believe that disembodied brains are particularly interesting or useful or even a sensible thing to study, right? Brains are connected to bodies, and each brain is connected to its own body, and different species have different bodies. And I think that understanding the interactions between them. I mean, I in theory, I completely agree. In practice, I was raised not as a motor physiologist, but as a sensory physiologist. And so I do keep defaulting to thinking about the sensory side of things, but that I recognize as a limitation of mine, and I'm trying to break from it. So I think if you're saying that we can't study a disembodied brain, but rather have to think about it in the context of a body, I'm all with you on that.
Well, if you say that, then how can you say that once we get the mouse to mouse intelligence, we can more easily get to human intelligence? Because our bodies are so different from mice. Even our sensory inputs are, we care much more about vision, and mice care more about smells, or so on.
Fair enough. I mean, when I say, once we achieve mouse intelligence, I don't think, I think we'll be close to human intelligence. I think we will have done the hard work. But sure enough, right, we're going to need to and when I say mice, again, I'm not literally that interested in mice per se, although they happen to be what I study. But the point is the intelligence of a simple mammal rather than trying to jump straight to a human. That's it. Saying mouse intelligence is shorthand for those ideas. So, certainly there will be all sorts of specializations for different sensory systems. As you say, mice are less visual than humans. They're more olfactory. Different rodents have different dependence on the auditory system, etc. But because I do think that there's a lot to be learned from understanding in particular how the cortex works. And because I think there's a lot of reason to believe that the overall structure of the cortex of a mouse and of a monkey and of a human share a lot of elements. I guess that's really what is driving me. This belief that there is this magic scalable cortical module, and that it evolved about, whenever mammals first arose, 90 million years ago, thereabouts. And that, there's variations on a theme, but that for me is the holy grail.
Okay, thanks a lot.
So Tony, I don't even know where to begin, really. I mean, what's actually
even wrong.
Yeah. What's pleasant? What I like about it is that I so completely disagree with you along the lines that Ida did, but at the same time, I kind of agree with you with respect to AI. So in other words, there are two ways that one could have an argument with you. One would be that AI is all about generic substrate and ever fancier learning rules. And what you're saying is, no, actually, the details of the substrate matter. And that's why you're not going to get there with AI. And so even a AI-based mouse is never going to get there unless they understand the specificity of substrate versus ever better learning rules on generic substrate, with the accepting that they're beginning to fiddle with the architecture at, AI factories. And then there's that argument to be had. And I don't want to have that argument because I think Ida and Josh went after that. Obviously, one knows why you're saying that, because you probably believe it, and also because it's an enormous excuse to get your Connectome grandiosity funded, right? And it's interesting that
just to be clear on that, I hated neuroanatomy, and I was dragged kicking and screaming to it, and it was only because of years of coming back to the importance of connectivity that I realized that we had to bite the bullet and work on it. But really, it was a deeply, could be wrong, but it's a deeply seated belief that it's important.
No, right. But what I'm saying is that the logic of it all clicks, right? That once you talk about innateness, you talk about substrate, you talk about substrate, you talk about wiring, you talk about wiring, you need the connectome. It all follows. And then you make your case.
Internally coherent.
You're internally coherent. And then you, of course, make the tools over ideas claim. You know, everyone wheels out that tired statement by Freeman Dyson, and then people wheel out that tiresome statement by Feynman. And now the thing about Feynman's blackboard thing, Feynman got his Nobel Prize in 1965 for quantum electrodynamics. As far as I understood, he didn't create elementary particles. So presumably then, Feynman didn't understand anything that he was doing because he didn't build elementary particles, which is immediately absurd, right? Second, Feynman, if one reads him and not just pick one's favorite quotes to make one's claim, said that actually to understand something is when you can do it intuitively without having to descend to the details. So famously, he quoted Dirac, where Dirac said you could understand a set of equations without having to go through their detailed derivations. So in other words, there are levels of explanation that probably scale with the complexity of the phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So now...
Couldn't possibly fail to disagree less.
Right. So in other words, once you get by all that, we get to the bit that I agree with Ida about, which is that somehow, because of the genome and evolutionary time, it's a short hop, skip, and a jump from what a mouse does to what a primate or a human does. Okay, now, the thing about, I think Ida got frustrated, and I think she was right, is let me give an example of your argument. If you look at the evolution of wings from limbs, okay, and you look at feathers and you look at wings, and people feel like birds evolved from some kind of, you know, pre-bird-like, whether it was a reptile or a mammal, right? At some point, it was important for the limb to grow disproportionately long with respect to body size, and then the integument had to turn into feathers. Now, the way you're arguing it is one could have stared at a regular arm for long enough and inferred flight from it. Because it's not that big, because it's not that big of a distance in evolutionary time from a limb to a wing. It's just the same bones, muscles, skin turns into feathers. But what you got was a kind of phase transition, a qualitative emergent property that suddenly allowed a limb to be a wing and for flight to happen. When I flap my arms, I don't fly a little bit. Okay, I don't fly at all. All right, so in other words, you can get, and I think Josh said this last week, qualitative changes in the properties of an object or a brain area when you can tell quite a simple contiguous evolutionary story as well. So that doesn't help at all, that kind of argument. All right, so in other words,
I think you know, we can argue by analogy. It's a nice one. I guess I would say that would be the argument against looking at epithelial cells in order to gain insights into how the nervous system works.
Or bones or muscles.
You know, if you could look at, so you can hold the view that language which evolved, let's for the sake of argument say 100,000 years ago, was a qualitative jump that was, you know, different from everything that preceded it. That humans are this quantum leap beyond all other creatures, and you know that there are people who hold that
it's not
view.
a quantum leap.
Fact, well, but there are people who hold that view. In fact, that is the core view, for example, in many religions, that there's humans and everything else. As a biologist, I hold the view.
Yeah, we're just talking about a simple concept of emergence. Physicists have been fine with this idea for ages, sure, that you can get qualitative changes in a behavior.
You can. Right. We absolutely agree that's possible.
And you have nothing, but you have no counter argument.
You're right. I'm betting my career on the idea that we gain insights about humans by studying non-human animals. I think a
No
lot of
one-
neuroscientists
no
hold
one-
that view, but it might be wrong, right?
Right, but it's
It could be wrong.
just what I find. It's just there's a way to word that which sounds extremely reasonable, and no one would disagree. And of course, we should study other animals, both for their own intrinsic interest and also because we will learn generalizable principles, right? But it would be very strange to study flight in me. Okay, so it depends what quality you're trying to study. Now, some things, and my brother's given this example, if you want to understand the laminar flow of water, you don't need to know about the atomic structure of it. If you want to know
Let me
about—
put it a different way. It would be very hard. Okay, if we're working within your analogy, right? If I wanted to study flight, but I didn't understand anything about how muscles worked, I didn't understand how joints worked, and I didn't understand how skin got covered with stuff like feathers or fur, right? And I wanted to understand animal flight. Well, probably if I went straight to studying a bald eagle, right? And I said, you know what? I'm really not interested in joints. I find those uninteresting. I don't find muscles interesting. I want to understand flight. And so I'm not going to study simple models, let's say the frog leg, for how muscle contraction works. Just going to go to, I think if we limited ourselves to bald eagles in our
limited, but
flight,
but Tony, I'm sorry.
I think we wouldn't get there.
I know, but Tony, but you're making
that we can, let me just finish. I think the reason we can actually hope to make progress on how bald eagles fly is that the foundation is pretty clear. We understand muscles, we understand joints, and now the question is how they get put together slightly differently.
But that's not how flight was understood. You're making up. People didn't study joints and muscles. People didn't understand. People didn't study joints and muscles to understand flight. What happens is you have a behavior, you have a functionalist view of it, and then you fill in the details and confirm in a feedback loop to the details. But what you're saying is you believe that you can basically bottom up from details, infer. You said it yourself. We're going to look at the canonical circuit like a diagram, and we're going to have an aha moment.
No, I said, wouldn't it be nice if that were the case?
But yeah, right. But your project.
I don't believe it.
I agree with Tony. I think I would like to advocate for Tony, which is kind of a weird thing for me to do. But I'm just going to go on a limb and disagree with John here. I think there's a difference between understanding flight and understanding how an eagle flies.
Yes.
Tony is saying
that was what I was about to say. Thank you.
Yeah. The functionalist thing is you just care about cognition. And Tony's question is, how do animals get the cool capacities that they have? Not
if I want to study aerodynamics.
No, but Josh, it's not true because he wants to extrapolate. He wants to extrapolate.
Yeah, you're so close. You're so close to the classic argument, right? Which is we don't study birds to build better planes, right? That's the argument that goes against the reverse engineering approach, right? That's the canonical argument, right? Like, okay, it's true that the fact that birds fly provided an.
That's actually not the argument I was making. Actually,
yeah, but you're very close to it.
I know, but don't.
But you're not distinguishing between what you mean by understanding flight. What you might mean is understanding aerodynamics, which is an important thing to understand, or you might be interested in how a bald eagle flies. And it's not clear to me when you say understand flight, which of those two, or maybe there's some third one.
I'm saying that if you wanted to understand how a bald eagle flies,
okay,
what would actually happen is a bald eagle. What would not work is if a bald eagle flying is cognition, and a mouse walking is precognition. What you would not do is study a mouse's muscles and joints and say, I'm going to extrapolate those concepts to flying, which I'm saying is an emergent phenomena that requires you to study flying and then cycle back
what
to
I'm
that.
Saying is, what I'm saying is,
I want to hear what Ida has to say about this.
Can I just say, what I'm saying is that the reason you wouldn't do that is because we actually understand enough about muscles and joints. But if we had a level of ignorance about basic physiology basic muscles and bones and joints that we do about the nervous system, actually, we'd really be making a mistake by jumping straight to bald eagle flight. And we'd be a lot better off by starting with.
That's just, that's just a sort of reductionist.
It'd be
default.
disappointing because it would mean that we wouldn't get to study bald eagles flying for another 50 years.
This
This is sort of what's been happening.
So
anyway,
if I may,
I think Ida wanted to.
Ida may.
yeah, before we move into the conversation, the sort of asking another question, I just want to say one thing about this. There is a disparity between what you said about I will understand something if I can sort of I don't understand it until I can make it. Heavier than air flight was not possible. I've watched so many sort of everything that I could ever see when I was a child about Da Vinci and like looking at the drawings and everything. Every attempt at flight that was mimicking birds and their joints and everything failed miserably. And the ones that actually did not fail were the ones that looked at it from a functional perspective. And so just wanted to put it out there. And in fact, there is a book, Wittgenstein Flies a Kite, which looks at how Wittgenstein started out trying to solve this problem and figured out that's when that was solved, then moved to philosophy. So it's a very interesting parallel here. I think that we have a couple of interesting questions that we might want to get to. I just want to first mention Paul Chizek mentioned something on here. At some point, maybe we can get him on stage. I want to ask whether the next high voted question that we have is by G. Cohn. Would you like to be on stage? Would you like to ask your question on stage if we invite you? So Paul would be interested. Would G. Cohn be interested? Well, either of you, whoever I guess accepts first, if Jovo could invite them, please, so we can have more questions. And yeah.
Looks like Paul is joining us now.
Okay.
Hi.
Paul?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just had a point kind of in defense of Tony and in response to the challenge that Josh posed quite a bit earlier, which was, can you design an experiment that could demonstrate some of the things that we're discussing? And I think one sort of experiment would be to take account of the fact that monkeys and humans have extremely different lifestyles. My life is very different from a monkey. Just the kinds of behaviors I do, the kinds of things that concern me. And therefore, if learning is the key, then if you look at our brain structure and organization, I mean here functional organization, not necessarily anatomy, functional organization, it should really be different than that of a monkey. Whereas if the underlying inherited structure that we actually share with monkeys 30 million years ago, with chimps 6 million years ago, if that is what actually organizes our behavior, then despite the fact that our lives are so different, the functional architecture should be the same. And I think that everything we know from neuroscience points to the latter. The architecture does actually seem to be very similar. And I think that tells us that I think Tony's right about some of that, some of the claims that he's making. So anyway, it's really more a question for Josh, but maybe Tony has something to add as well.
I'm going to quit while I'm ahead here.
Yeah, I think I'm with Paul. I think like I said before, there's certain things I disagree with Tony about, but the main point that there's a lot to be gained by understanding the actual anatomy. That's the fundamental thing that he and I agree with. I think Paul is in agreement with that as well. We've all come to for different reasons.
I would just say it's just not even worked for central pattern generators, Paul. I mean, David Parker's written some beautiful papers out of Cambridge showing that we haven't even succeeded when it comes to central pattern generators. The best way to contemplate a central pattern generator is to as he's argued, you have to abstract away to a half center model, and the thing is, all the detail,
the functional, that's what I'm saying, not the details. The half center
but
it's going to apply to lamprey. It's going to apply to tetrapods. Certain computational principles. I'm not talking about synaptic matrix, the whole connectome is going to be exact. I'm talking about major things, dorsal and ventral streams. They exist in humans, they exist in monkeys. The organization of frontal lobes is actually not that different. I mean, yes, of course there are differences, and that's where we should be looking, right? But the fact that despite the incredibly different lives that we have, the basic larger principles are actually not so dramatically different, I think speaks to a certain underlying architecture that is inherited and that we've done very clever things with. But we're building on top of it, and we need to know what it is.
Since John seems to have frozen, I'm going to...
No, he's just like that. He stops like that sometimes.
I haven't noticed that in many conversations.
I got him to not have anything to say.
So just to not make fun of his bad Wi-Fi. So you mentioned, I asked you in the chat whether the fact that crows and humans from different branches evolutionarily, but both of them are capable of hierarchical goal-directed planning, which some other creatures, actually mammals that are closer to human, can't do at the level that some crows can do. Beautiful work that has been done, and I'm a fan of it, in fact. And you mentioned, in that case, we need to see their lineage, but I'm not sure. There is a point at which we can say there is a function, and this function can be understood in itself. And if the large-scale brain principles that you guys are talking about is large-scale enough, then in principle, we don't need to worry about the nitty-gritty at all. We don't need to look at the last level of evolution. We can just look at the large-scale principle. As long as the artificial algorithms we are building respects those general computational principles that are at large scales, they can be successfully and biologically plausibly show the same function without having to imitate the evolutionary lineage. By the way,
I think actually the example there is a very good example of two lineages that came up with certain solutions to certain problems independently. But we don't actually know whether they came up to those solutions through similar mechanisms. And in fact, if we want to understand the mechanism in a bird, we have to study the lineage that leads to birds. We have to study what is it that differs between birds that can use tools versus birds that don't use. We have to sort of follow that lineage to birds, and then we follow the lineage to humans. And after we're done with both, only then can we really discuss are the mechanisms the same, et cetera, because the common ancestors didn't do any of that. So I think the example is a great example of the fact, octopus. I
was just going to say.
Yeah, I totally agree. Maybe I can interject. I feel like the conversation is going elsewhere. So here's the thing that I think is going elsewhere. The issue is not to understand the mechanism of a bird or mechanism of a human. The issue, if you're thinking from the artificial intelligence perspective, is when can we have AI that can have functions like the ones that humans and crows do? Since this seems to be a functionalist situation where birds and humans and AI can have the same function with very different underlying implementation, it seems like this is also an argument for functionalism.
Can we, let me just raise an issue here.
Sure, absolutely.
Certainly, artificial neural networks can do things today that they couldn't do 30 years ago, right? So right? Like they now are useful and they can solve a bunch of interesting problems. So what changed? Well, computers are faster, right? That, GPUs, there are a couple little tweaks, but one of the big tweaks, right, was an architectural tweak, right? Convolutional neural networks, right? So the fact that, placing a particular constraint on the wiring diagram of an artificial neural network yielded some pretty powerful results is, I think, one of the strongest existence proofs that architectural constraints are potentially have a payoff, okay? And so the question, so clearly, at least, okay, to my mind, I do not hope or expect or want to slavishly take all the information that it goes into wiring a mammalian brain and plug that into a computer. On the other hand, right, the strategy that we are currently pursuing for better there are some exceptions, and I know what I'm about to say is not correct, entirely correct, but at least let's say that the major success that we had in an architecture in the past came from some very smart people, Jan LeCun and others, sitting down and thinking hard about what would constitute a better architecture, right? And so that's almost like the old school of symbolic AI, right? Where the way you approach a problem is you sit in your chair and you think hard about how you might go about solving this problem. And if you are a particularly bright graduate student, then you get a thesis, but it never generalizes, right? And that was the failure mode there, right? And so, we have this home run from convolutional networks and some attempts to sort of systematize the search through architecture space. But I guess what I'm arguing is that there is gold hidden in that space of architectures, and that if we think hard about how to find it, right? And one way might be to go look exactly at actual nervous system. But actually, I will say that on as a side project, as a collaboration with one of my colleagues, Alex Kulikov, we're actually pursuing another approach, which is to take the idea that nervous systems arise from genomes and use the idea that you have to pass the wiring diagram through a genomic bottleneck seriously. And we're actually taking that as an algorithm. We're compressing wiring diagrams, and we're finding a way to find better architectures that are subject to the constraint that they have been compressed through. We call it a genome, but it's just that they're compressed, right? And that there's a set of rules. So I'm saying that like those that maybe that's a way of sort of establishing some common ground, because the fact that crows and octopuses and possibly other creatures are capable of these things, in fact, is a demonstration that there's not only one solution. I happen to for a variety of sort of personal reasons, being a mammal, I have sort of a particular interest in them. A couple other reasons, right? Like I happen to be putting my money on that particular one. But man, I would love to hire some, and have a colleague next door who's studying octopus intelligence. That would be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Right?
But can I just say something? There just seems to be a fundamental contradiction here between the positions that you're taking. On the one hand, I hear from Paul.
You told me I was self-consistent.
Yeah, but I know that it's so interesting. It's like this illogical inconsistency comes up over and over again. On the one hand, you say that we needed this qualitative tweak, the convolutional neural net, the translational invariance feature that we learned from biology, to go along with the quantitative change, which was faster GPUs, bigger data sets, more layers, right? Fine. But then I hear from you that, look, there's no real difference qualitatively in the architecture from a mouse to a monkey to a human. So you're making a purely quantitative case. But if you're making a purely quantitative case, in other words, it's like you want it on both ways. Sometimes you'll argue for a qualitative architectural feature, and other times you'll say that's the same architecture. So once you've worked it out in mammal X, it will be true in mammal Y and Z. And what's fallen back on? An empty statement like Paul makes that something clever happens. Okay? So in other words, decide which argument you're on. Are you on the quantitative side and therefore we'll just extrapolate? Or are you on the qualitative one? And if you're on the qualitative one, then we have to study each animal separately. So which one is it?
Do I walk to school or carry my lunch?
By the way, we need to ask some questions. So, like, feel free to respond.
To this.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, the people are waiting to ask the questions.
Go ahead.
My belief is that the mammals have a scalable cortex that, with a bit of evolutionary pressure, can enable them to do the things that mice do. With a little more pressure in the right way, can enable them to solve the challenges that non-human primates solve. So, what drove them was a bunch of things that didn't drive. Mice have brains that are good enough for mice. It's not clear they would benefit from having that much better brains. Monkeys needed to be intelligent. That was sort of the the route they went on is probably driven more by social contingencies
Sure,
and
but
other
that's
things.
not the question. It's
No,
what's
but
the
it is
count?
because I'm saying that they essentially have the convolutional network already. It's just smaller, right? It fits into
So it's
their
a
brain.
quantitative difference.
But there
Yeah,
are
as far as
architectural differences between these animals.
there might be.
Rodents don't have granular prefrontal cortex. They don't have the temporal lobe
Sure.
like we. I mean, they're there, and they explain some of the differences between us.
Why don't we let a
Qualitative.
couple people? I think that you're doing a good thing by trying to box me into a couple of different choices, but I think I would prefer not to. I think I'd like to unpack the analogy and then build a different box out of the little pieces you've given me. And in the interest of time, I think that that construction project we should maybe put off to the side.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to start reading some questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Paul. It was awesome. You can stay here if you want, because a lot of these questions might be related to you. So Nidhi Sitapatis, she's in Conrad's lab. She's asking, aren't innate strategies just learning, but over longer time scales?
Sure.
In parentheses, evolution.
Sure. If you want to call all forms of adaptation learning, that's not the way biologists use those terms, but that's a reasonable thing. So biologists have this sort of funny thing that they think about learning as something that can occur only in one lifetime, and that if it happens over many lifetimes, they don't call it learning anymore.
Is there a paper that specifically says you can't call this learning and you can't apply learning models?
Words are however you use them, but if you consistently use the word learning to refer to, let's say, the change in limb length over 50 generations, you'll find that biologists are very confused.
Yeah. So here's the
thing.
The people who build learning models, they use learning models to understand how things change over evolutionary scale. So that exists, computational biology and computational accounts of evolution. So I'm not sure what you have in mind, but I think the question comes also, since it comes from a computational neuroscientist, I think it's a very valid question.
I think, so I am here, I think somewhere in my paper, I even explicitly talk about there being an inner loop, right, which happens during an organism's lifetime, and an outer loop, which happens between lifetimes. And when talking to one of the things that I tried to do in my paper, and that I try to do in general, is to make sure that when different groups of people disagree, they're not just disagreeing because they use words differently. And so we can use whatever words people want in a given sort of in a different setting. I can use the word learning to refer to appetite. I can use the word hair color. Yeah, I can redefine words however I want. But
no. This is systematic. It's not arbitrary.
But the way that biologists, and I would say the vast majority of neuroscientists, use the word learning is it's something. So we could then have a conversation about whether that is indeed the way that these communities use that word. That would be a very Wittgensteinian research program or maybe even a linguist. We go and ask how different groups of people use different words. But my impression is that most neuroscientists refer to learning as being limited to what happens during a living organism's lifetime, and evolution to refer to other stuff. Now, when we talk about artificial systems, which don't have well-defined lifetimes, then there's this sort of fuzziness about how those words are used. And I think that leads to confusion.
So I disagree, because there's computational biology work on using learning algorithms for understanding evolution, but we can agree to disagree on that. I'm going to move on to the next question by G. Cohn. And they're asking, and it's a longer question, so I hope that I can read it appropriately. Can Tony comment on how the use of innateness seems to be simply a way to bypass actual understanding of developmental processes? For instance, in many cases, the circuit controlling a behavior depends on the behavior preceding the ontogeny of these neural circuits. That is, movements prenatally shape the connections in the motor cortex before we have a motor cortex. Parenthesis open. Also, he will get it. How do we load Shakespeare into the genome? Question mark, parenthesis close.
Yeah, so that's
reading of a question.
So I think if I could rephrase the question, there are two sources of information that give rise to a given circuit, right? To the circuit that is my brain, right? One source of information is the genome, and the second source of information is the outside world, the neurobiology of the, yay. Yeah, so one source comes from my genome, and the other source comes from outside my genome, which is everything else. And so the process of converting a genome into a circuit, the early part of that process is called development. And then as the influences from the outside world become more important, as experiences become more important, we sort of shift that, the terminology from development to learning. Biology, I don't think really makes a clear distinction between those two. The mechanisms of development are really similar and shared evolutionarily in practice with the mechanisms of learning. And so it's not a perfect distinction. The example he gives of animals walking or moving prenatally is a great one. The one that I usually think about. So there's classic work on how you establish binocular cells, and you need two eyes open. Is that a developmental process? Is it learning? I mean, I don't know. Again, I think it's semantics. I think if we understand what's going on, in detail, we don't really have to be sort of rigid about how we use those terms. So, is it a shortcut to talk about innate? Sure, in the same way that nature nurture is a shortcut, right? And obviously both are important and they interact, and I think it's just a restatement of that. I'm not sure if he's still around or if he found that a satisfying answer.
So if you're in the audience still, please let us know if this was an adequate answer, G column, or if you would like us to say something else. I don't think so. Okay, so the next question is from Noah Petit, and they're asking, is there a limit to the level precision at which neural wiring specificity can be genetically encoded? Depending on that level of specificity, what might that tell us about the kinds of neural networks implementations that evolution has arrived at? For example, to make it more concrete, should we be constraining our models to exist in a space where sloppy wiring can still produce proper behavior of the network?
Yeah, so so the answer is that it is possible for genomes to specify wiring very precisely. So again, returning to the example of C. elegans, I guess 80% of the connections are perfectly stereotyped. And even though 20% are not perfectly stereotyped, my guess is they're not random, but they're probably drawn. Josh, you would probably know this, but they're probably drawn from a small number. So that's a case where, and there are many examples in invertebrates where you get very precise wiring, but that doesn't scale. Okay, the point is that doesn't scale, right? You can't fit a detailed wiring diagram, at least an arbitrarily complex detailed wiring diagram, into a genome. So what that means is there have to be rules. And what we know from development is that those rules are often stochastic, right? The rules are not of the form wire neuron 227,342 to neuron 67. They're stuff like, pick 3 out of your 12 closest neighbors and wire to them. Pick 3 or 4 of your 12 closest neighbors and wire them up, something like that. I mean, it's not exactly that, but it's rules of the sort of lower complexity form. And so, yeah, indeed, I believe that the brains that we have are the ones that can be encoded with these pretty stochastic, relatively simple rules. And to my mind, that's the challenge, and it's one that I'm actively working on. And I should say that even though I'm having more fun with this than anything else I've done today, well, for sure, because I'm writing a grant. But you know, I'm actually having a great deal of fun. My main job actually is as Uber driver for my kids, and I'm pretty soon gonna, if I don't leave in like the next 5 or so minutes, I'm gonna be late, and then I'm gonna get like 2 stars. And there's nothing worse than losing, you know, losing stars from your kids. They just won't call you anymore.
Thank you. I guess we can take one more question, maybe.
Oh, yes. Hello. I'm a graduate student. I really liked your discussion on the contribution of innateness. So the neuroscientist David Puppel has a paper from 2012 where he distinguishes this mismatch between the parts list that is given by the cognitive scientists and the parts lists that are given by the neuroscientists, in particular the computational neuroscientists. And he says, you know, the cognitive scientists will posit some sort of parts list, you know, like I think he focuses on linguistics where you give, you know, what are the putative fundamental operations for language. And then he says, you know, the neuroscientists will also give what you noted at the beginning of your talk as a parts list. And he says, you know, the problem is that there's no good morphism between them. In fact, we don't even know how to construct one. And so what I'm wondering is,
well, it's the network, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what your view is on what an appropriate type of relationship between some sort of these two parts lists are, and how we would even know when we would, if we found one, and how we could even test that, maybe not experimentally, but at least in some nice way that would convince people.
Yeah, like, I mean, I guess as far as I can tell, you're sort of asking, how do you cross the levels all the way from, you know, synapses and neurons and axons up to sort of the elements that cognitive scientists think about? I think it's really hard. I mean, I think I can get as far as figuring out, like, what I'm working on is crossing all the way from those parts to the sort of simpler forms of cognition that lab animals can perform, right? And so in principle, right, we could hope to understand things like, how does working memory work? You know, how is a long-term memory formed? How do you make a decision? Things that you can actually study in a lab animal, and hope that the insights that you get about how lab animals implement these sort of potentially cognitive level behaviors could carry over to humans. I mean, I started off in linguistics, but I find it frustrating that I can't get any traction on that with anything that I do.
Yeah, I'm the same way. That's why I asked the question. Yes.
Yeah. So I think I'm really gonna have to run now.
Thanks so much, Tony, for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. You are awesome. I hope you don't mind the back
Oh,
and forth.
I love it. I love it. I only wish it could have gone on farther, longer.
Bye, Tony.
No.
All right, bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Tony. It was awesome. Thank you, Paul.
Should we summarize for everybody?
Sure.
So I can summarize. Thanks, Paul. For those of you who don't know, Paul is joining us in a few weeks to talk about some of his other ideas. We're very excited.
Oh, good. We can have at him a bit more.
We are very excited about having him.
Look forward to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
We look forward to it too.
So I thought that was really fun and engaging. One thing that I think was really interesting about it is, in a sense, I think most people in AI actually—
Are we still on, by the way, or not?
We're still on.
Good.
I think most people agree, actually, with Tony. It's fun to argue with him, but fundamentally, if you look at all the papers recently in AI, there's a ton of work on people just coming up with new architectures that do better.
I just completely disagree. I agree with the idea. I agree with the what I completely agree with is we know from the unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms to the first annelids and onwards that there is an evolution of complexity, which is a fascinating topic unto itself. And one of the fundamental principles is of modularity. Okay, so to the degree that has been a universal principle since the partitioning of organelles within single cells. So the idea that the modularity and the details of the bits of the parts matters, it's so obvious, it's almost unbelievable that we're having that discussion. What the real point where I fundamentally disagree is that knowing the connectome doesn't tell us what the algorithms or the computations are. And it has been hopeless so far being able to reverse engineer any interesting cognitive phenomena from the connectome.
That's
okay,
right.
so in other words, so what you have to ask yourself is, what kind of question is the connectome useful for? And I think it's useful the way a library full of reference books is useful. That once you've come up with an interesting question and formulation, you can then go for a kind of confirmatory browse in the library. But the idea that you're going to have some kind of algorithmic insight when it comes to complex behaviors by taking a stare at the details of the wiring, it's not even worked for C. elegans.
Wait,
right?
so I just, yeah, I kind of,
So
I
in
mean,
other words, it's just, you have to ask, it just doesn't
Sorry.
work.
Wait, Jova, like, I think that you're misunderstanding something profoundly about AI. And it might be that, so having different kinds of architectures or biases or priors does not mean that the same thing as what Tony is saying. Just having different architectures just is not the level that Tony is suggesting. It doesn't mean that if the movement from a mouse to human is a small movement, and it doesn't mean that we need to understand the mouse brain before we can understand language. None of that follows from the fact that we are creating different algorithms. And I agreed with John, we had to like move on because of the questions, that Tony seems to be having inconsistent things that he says. He said another inconsistent thing earlier. So for people who might want to rewatch this, there was another point where we had to call on kind of inconsistencies in his perspective. And that was for the, first of all, the heavier than air flight. Actually, it didn't work out when people tried to look at the joints and exactly mimic how the birds were sort of, what the feathers or the joints were doing. Another thing is that, as a matter of fact, having different kinds of architectures might mean that we don't need to know anything, or, okay, it helps to know something, but it doesn't, we are not required, it's not necessary to know much about the rodent in order to be able to understand certain, or build functionally operational models, functionalistically operational models of certain kinds of human cognitive function.
So just to be clear, I agree with both, everything Ida said and everything John said, and a lot of things that Tony said. My point is he's made a lot of claims, and some of them we can all agree to, and then others of them we can disagree about. But it's interesting that some of the things he said, I think we all do agree with. And that one thing is that the architectures matter a lot, and we will benefit by studying the architectures more. That's true in neural network literature. There's lots of work on studying architectures, and neural architecture search is now fundamental to making progress in terms of gains. John, you're
muted. You're muted.
So you can't interrupt me.
There's a difference between identifying the need for a decomposable modularity into functions that need to generate intelligence of the kind you want to study. But do not confuse, like I think Ida was saying, the need to identify decomposition into computational modules, which can also be called architecture, with knowing that neuron A is connected to neuron B is connected to neuron C. I mean, we've known that for the cerebellum, and we still don't know what it does. We've known that for CBG. So in other words, you need something else to get some kind of insight. And just looking at the wiring, which is what this massive gear up for the connectome is, it's not that it's not an interesting library and can be used, but what I find infuriating and in a kind of a bad faith is that we're going to get algorithmic and computational insights from the bottom up, and it's just not worked overall.
Right. So just to be clear, I have no reason to think that that will work, and that's not what I'm claiming will work. And I don't actually think Tony thinks that. And I know if I'm working lots of
He does actually, though, because he thinks that if you look at a canonical cortical circuit and you work out its details, that all you need to do is then take that canonical circuit and scale it to 10 of them or 20 of them, and voila, you have more complex cognition.
I don't know if he agrees with that. I certainly don't.
That's in his paper, and that was on his slides. So I just actually took a note of it. He said it's a big step to an artificial mouse brain or mouse intelligence, but then from there would be a small step from mice to language and cognition. And you have his slides, so you can check. One thing that I want to highlight is that so I want to first thank very much Kanaka and Brad for handling the discussions on the chat. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Claire-san, who has also helped us offline and on the chat by echoing people's questions, even though we didn't manage to get there. And I think that there was a point raised by Brad and Claire, whether it would be fair to continue discussing somebody's work after they have gone. Obviously, it's a salon, and we were mostly disagreeing with Jova right now than to begin with. But I think that I would like to thank you for raising that point. And perhaps at this point, we could sort of close and thank everybody. Do you guys have some closing things that you would like to say before we thank everyone?
No, I think this was great. Everybody's participation was great. I'd like to also thank my student, Eva, who's helped out a lot in the background as well.
Yeah, thank you, Eva.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, especially thank Eva and Claire, because they're the junior members of the team that are helping us run smoothly, and they offer us their input as well, which I really appreciate. Okay, so I guess looking at the chats, thank you so much for everyone who is also very actively participating. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Neeti, for your question. Thank you, Tara. All right. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Yeah, bye.